afternoon. I'm Shelley Rogers, the coordinator of Fashion for the Earth at earthday.org, and today we are very pleased to have with us Rachel Kibbe. Rachel is the founder and CEO of Circular Services Group, a boutique advisory consultancy guiding leaders, investors, and institutions through systems change, regulatory shifts, and emerging market opportunities, and the founder and CEO of American Circular Textiles. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you for having me, Shelley.
I'd like to start with by saying that I think you have been on the same path from the time you were young. And even with some detours or obstacles in your way, you have been able to pivot, reinvent yourself, and stay on that same path. And I mean from childhood, when you were riding around on your dirt bike through a junkyard with some buddies, you have said that among the group, you were probably the only one who thought a lot about that junk. Where did it come from? Why all this junk? What's it about? And I think at that point you were showing the first sign of being a systems thinker, which I think you are very much a systems thinker. You went to Parsons School of Design and you got your degree in fashion design, but there you had some very disappointing internships. Can you talk about why they were disappointing and what you saw there?
Sure. I think it was sort of the time, and it was also just how the fashion industry works, and I didn't know. So part of the program at Parsons for fashion design, they have this great opportunity for you to do as many internships as you want while you're studying for course credit, which I took advantage of. And so I was able in New York City to go to a number of different large organizations and emerging organizations and work in their offices and see how the sausage gets made. And this was around between 2007 and 2010. And around that time, the concept of fast fashion and the concept of just making too much at a pace that was unsustainable for both people and the planet was just starting to bubble up. And, you talk about systems thinking. I think you're right. I have always been a systems thinker. And so I saw a lot of challenges occurring in these New York City office environments of people just being overburdened with the amount of product they were expected to push out and that burden that they had to put on their factories abroad. And I'll leave it at that, but it was very eye-opening. And I thought, if people who are working here in New York City in the West are having such an issue keeping up with the pace of this industry, how might those other parts of the supply chain be dealing with these, what seemed to me to be impossible demands? And how might the planet be suffering from the consequences of the amount of virgin product we're putting out there?
You said at Parsons, I had what can only be described as a spiritual download. I received the overwhelming sense that the fashion industry's wheels were about to fall off and that it needed more changed leadership, both environmentally and socially. And I think that's one moment where you really pivoted. And you went into banking, but you didn't really give up on clothes and fashion at all. You started a side gig, but it wasn't such a little side gig. It was right. The very first, if not the very first, one of the very first online e-commerce clothing resale sites for sustainable clothing. And you had to fulfill criteria before you could get up on that site. It had to be sustainable. Let me just read what Refinery 29 said about you. They said, with Helpsy, Kibbe has quite possibly added the most provocative thing to e-commerce anyone ever could, a conscience. What a great thing that you did. And so, Rachel, you did that for 6 years, but then you kind of had to pivot again. Can you talk about the point where it was becoming overwhelming?
So in the grand scheme of things, we were, even though I ran it for 6 years and it was the most trafficked website for ethical and sustainable fashion in the world for a long time. But still, we were a relatively small organization in the grand scheme of fashion houses, right? And I myself was overburdened with the amount of excess inventory and returns that we had as a business. And I had a lot of customers, since we were this self-professed sustainable organization asking me, well, what do I do with my things when I no longer want them? How do I recycle my clothes? What is the best donation outlet? We hear all these rumors about products getting exported and impacting other economies. And I didn't know anything about that part of the supply chain. I was primarily focused on how things were made up until that point. And so the last few years of running that business before I merged it with a large scale used clothing collector, I had a lot of private conversations with business mentors, friends, and family about whether or not I wanted to sell new product at all anymore.
Then in 2022, you branched out with a second organization, which is separate from your circular services group. And this is American Circular Textiles. Can we talk about American Circular Textiles?
American Circular Textiles is really an extension of the work we continue to do at Circular Services Group is like you said, look at these systems and think, okay, we're in a time of major transition. Businesses are looking for answers. The fact of the matter is we live under a capitalist system and businesses have to grow. And so consulting in so many different aspects of the circular economy up until that point, whether it was on-demand used clothing collectors, large-scale municipal clothing collection systems, working with brands and retailers who, as you mentioned, were under pressure to no longer burn their inventory and figure out alternate routes for it. I was just a girl in her apartment mapping global supply chains, right? And I got to a point where I thought this is insanity and started researching how other industries transition and seeing other pockets of policy. I believe at that time, the Fashion Act had already been introduced. So there was the zeitgeist was there for fashion policy, right? But there was no focus yet on end of life waste. So I gathered together a number of organizations. I think we're between 6 and 8 at that time, primarily resale organizations, because those are the ones that had scaled the most in the US. Recycling, it came later for us as an organization to bring those organizations in and brought them together and created a coalition and brought together a number of advisors and hired a number of people through the support of our founding members to help us start to think through how do we introduce this to Congress? How do we talk about this? What do we want? And we were really learning as we went.
You said one of your first aims with American Circular Textiles was to write a policy paper, which you did. You wrote a national blueprint for effective EPR. You said the policymakers had to be brought up to speed on the industry's current circularity efforts. Not easy to get a hold of lawmakers. Very hard. They can resist you. So, I mean, how did you reach out to them? Was it the policy paper that was helpful in reaching them, or did you have to lobby? How did you get them interested in this?
Right. So, actually, the first paper you wrote was called, and is still called, the United States Opportunity for Circular Fashion. And we wrote that for exactly that reason. We knew this is going to be hard to get in front of the right people. Why should they care? And what is the opportunity here? And that's exactly what that paper lays out. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities specifically for the United States? Because there had been gobs of literature and white papers and studies done in Europe, but that you can't bring that simply to US lawmakers and say, here you go, here's proof. They want to know, what kind of impact is this going to have? What kind of impact does this have on my communities? And what is the workforce potential, economic opportunity? And that's what that paper lays out, so we could get a foot in the door. So we would have a piece of literature to bring to staffers in Congress and federal agencies and various states and say, here's how we see things right now, and here's why we think you should be interested in this. And fortunately, they were. We hired some very good people who got us in front of people who might care about this too, in front of the right people, and really leaned on expertise of those who had been working in policy for many years. but it was surprising, but also not surprising. A lot of the staff members were already shopping thrift. They were renting their wardrobes. They have watched the news, and so this wasn't entirely the problem. Wasn't entirely the environmental and social problem of making too much and having nowhere for it to go wasn't entirely new to a lot of folks, but they didn't necessarily know what kind of policy levers could be applied.
And that brings us to the America's Trade and Investment Act, better known by its short form, the America's Act, which was introduced in March of 2024 in the U.S. Senate. You have played a very big part in this, Rachel. You said nearly 2 years ago when we started American Circular Textiles, we knew we wanted public policy support, both at the state and federal level, to bring jobs back to our communities and grow businesses keeping textiles out of the trash. But we could not have known that we'd have the opportunity to write the first federal circular textile incentive plan in history with United States Senators Bill Cassidy and Michael Bennet in the America's Act that, if passed, could fundamentally change the landscape of circular textile manufacturing and innovation here in the U.S. Did the senators approach you about this, or did you reach out to them specifically about this idea?
So at face value, we approached them because we were having conversations with many, many different lawmakers in Congress. But we learned when we had our first conversation with Senator Cassidy's office, that they had heard me speak at a briefing on the topic. And so they were glad that we had reached out, and they had this piece of legislation that they were working on, where they were looking for an organization like ours to consult on provisions for the decarbonization piece of textiles that were already in the bill. It's a very large bill. It deals a lot with trade and textiles, which we do not take credit for. We specifically consulted on the circular textile provisions, which were about 2 pages of then a 219-page bill. But it was kind of a good match. It was, and we have that paper that we shared with them. So we had done the footwork, and we had gained some respect and ears already in Congress. And so we weren't entirely a newcomer, but we were still new. So it was very much right place, right time, and we had done the work.
Well, like you said, this is a very big bill. It wants to encourage textile manufacturing. Correct me if I'm wrong. It means to expand what operations are already here, or encourage.
Yeah,
is that right?
This is where it gets sort of technical and wonky and challenging to sort of wrap your head around. But the fastest way I can explain it is that the future of textiles is circularity, and it includes what we are currently even offshoring, which is textile manufacturing, because in order to reprocess and respin yarn that is recycled, you need those facilities, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is we view them as no longer necessary to our economy and our trade base, and we've exported that all. But I think, you can think of used clothing as a commodity. It's an unregulated commodity, and we are the largest consumers of fashion in the world, or one of. That could be contested. China might be the most, but one of the largest consumers of clothing in the world. And currently, we are doing very little aside from sending it to landfill once it goes past its first owner, whereas we could be collecting this, reusing it more at scale, and then recycling the end waste of that, which would require what we consider sort of like the old way of manufacturing. So it's all necessary, but it does also include really critical, innovative material science, technology, innovation that is still in a lab or hasn't been invented. So it is the future, but includes many parts of the supply chain that we're giving away. And so that is a lot of the work we do in Congress, is say to lawmakers, hey, help us stop giving away these critical assets, the land assets, the infrastructure, the workforce who knows how to operate in this in this industry, because we need that if you want to remain competitive, because Europe and other parts of the world are investing in this heavily and we are not. And so this is the next wave of manufacturing. And if we want to, not to say we're going to own every part of it, it's unlikely for all of it to happen in the United States, but pieces of it are going to happen here. And it requires workforce, machinery, land, infrastructure that we are undervaluing, I would say, right now. So our portion of the Americas Act is looking at how do you both keep it here and bolster it through low interest, long-term capital, tax credits, innovation, public education, those types of things.
I want to just talk about what's a big deal in this bill is the money. Can you tell?
It's the money.
The money is huge.
I mean, it is huge, and it's intentionally huge. And like you said, it's very broad. It applies to any part of the reverse supply chain, whether you're a thrift store or reverse logistics. You would potentially have access to this pot of funds, reuse, resale, repair, of course, everyone in between. And it's a large pot of funds. That said, it has to be reintroduced. So that scale of funds is no longer legitimate because the bill would have to be reintroduced. But at the time, in March of 2024, when the Senator Cassidy and Bennett introduced this, it was $14 billion of grants and loans, 15% tax credit, a huge pot of funds for innovation and public education. And the reason being is we had looked at other sectors and the scale of sales that they have in the United States and realized, for instance, textiles is larger than the single passenger vehicle market in terms of U.S. sales. And so we looked at what types of pots of funds that, let's say, renewable energy or EV had gotten, and it was many, many multiples times the amount of funds we're asking for in this bill, but it is justified. And, I think it's something like it takes at least $500 million to stand up a recycling facility. And don't quote me on that. But I know that it's somewhere around there and more. And so $14 billion seems like a lot, but we're talking about fundamentally transforming the way we make things. Yeah. And so we need, and venture capital has its place in all of this, but venture capital is a very specific type of money, and it does not necessarily fund slower return businesses that require a lot of workforce and infrastructure to scale. So this is where federal and France is doing this. This is where governments can come in and they can get a return on this too, potentially. You know what I mean? But you need that low interest, long-term capital and long-term investment to be able to fund scaling up, or not just scaling up, breaking ground and scaling up a new industry.
You said that the people on Capitol Hill were familiar with the problems of fashion to a certain degree. But I was looking at studies recently that show people have knowledge, but it's somewhat superficial. They know about maybe microfibers or the size of the waist, or there's a lot of it, but they don't know it in any depth. So I think the public advocacy is going to be huge in this regard.
You mentioned that people know the problem, but they don't know the solutions. And I think that's where public advocacy can play a really big role. And people get a little problem fatigue, challenge fatigue, and can raise up their hands. But if you can provide them access to resources, where are the repair centers in my communities? How can I ethically donate clothing? Can I recycle my clothing? Does it exist? And then also, if you get the public more engaged, you create that demand channel. There needs to be a demand pull. You could create all this recycled content. It's going to be a little bit more costly right now. We know people don't want to spend more on their clothes. So if you don't explain to them why they should, you're not going to have a powerful enough purchasing base to be able to create that demand channel to scale up the unit economics that will then make it cost parity with virgin. We know it can reach cost parity and even less than virgin production, but you need consumers to buy it. You need that demand. So public education is critical. It's not just a moral good. It's people need to understand how and why and where to change their shopping behaviors.
How would new tariffs impact this bill?
I mean, as I mentioned, it's a huge bill and it's a very wonky trade bill, and I will not profess to be an expert on everything, including USMCA. What I do know, and we all know, is the landscape has fundamentally changed, both in law and by executive order, and through sentiment of how we engage in trade negotiations. So what's most interesting to us, and what I think, is being thought through if this bill is to be reintroduced, is that de minimis portion. The de minimis was closed through this bill. If it had passed, it would have closed the de minimis through reciprocal tariffs, which we all now know about. That was new to me at the time, and I think had it been introduced, folks had some confusion about what reciprocal means, and now we know. Through reciprocal tariffs, de minimis was closed. Now it is closed by executive order. What's interesting about that is de minimis funds were to fund programs like ours in the bill. Now, that is not entirely off the table, but it would likely need buy-in from the administration and Congress to be able to say, hey, now we're collecting all these new tariffs into the United States through closing de minimis, the loophole that allowed products under $800 to come in duty-free, no longer happening. So now there's, billions of dollars that will be collected through closing that loophole. We would love to see it fund programs like ours and others. We see that as the tariffs are a stick and serve their purpose, but without a carrot like incentives to scale infrastructure and manufacturing here. We're not sure how well they'll work long term.
Thank you so much for being here. I've learned a lot from today. I really have. And I've got my fingers crossed for the Americas Act. And I think that, I think it will pass. Thank
you. Bring it down to God's ears. Thank you so much, Shelley. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Take care, Rachel.
Take care.